But the Honourable Lady is right to say what she says. There are 3 pilot areas for rape courts, but each and every Crown Court is a court that is able to take on rape cases, and I'm determined to see that prosecutions rise and convictions rise as well.
Geraint Davies. Not here. Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for women who have been raped, the time that it takes to come to court, where it does come to court, is too often long and traumatic. What is my honourable friend doing to ensure that this time is shortened for all concerned?
Mr. Speaker, thank you, and I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this issue. Timeliness is clearly an important issue in ensuring that victims stay with and continue to support prosecutions, and my honourable friend is absolutely right. In terms of the number of days that it takes between police referral to CPS charge, that has been moving in the right direction and was 29 days faster in the last quarter. I do want to strike a note of caution, though. It is important to ensure that the evidence is right, and, Mr. Speaker, on occasions that can take some time.
James Daly.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I acknowledge the progress the government is making on this issue? But the real heart of this matter is the lack of referrals from the police, especially in rape cases, to the Crown Prosecution Service. We have a charge-out rate at present of around 1.7%. That has to change.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and again I pay tribute to my honourable friend who brings to this chamber and indeed to the Select Committee considerable experience, and I'm grateful for his question. In terms of charge rates, you will have heard that is one of the key metrics. The overall figure is 72.8%. That compares with all crime of 78.8%. It's not that far off, and he'll be pleased to know that in his local area the charge rate is increasing.
Sir James Duttridge.
Mr. Speaker, whilst welcoming the absolute increase in the number of rape prosecutions in Essex, the percentage of prosecutions is still pitifully low. What more can the Attorney-General to help excellent police crime commissioners like Roger Hurst and members of Parliament across Essex to improve the situation?
Mr. Speaker, thank you, and I thank my honourable friend for his question and for championing his local area. He is right, there is one thing that we can do, and that is to support victims. That is what we are doing, not least through the independent sexual violence advisors. And where victims have that help and support, they are 49% more likely to stay with the programme and to continue to support and progress through the criminal justice system.
Shadow Attorney-General Emily Thornley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I believe that the Solicitor General is now an old hand at this, but may I welcome the new Attorney General to her place. As the Solicitor will know, an estimated 1 in 5 women in this country have experienced the daily misery of being stalked and the constant fear that their stalker may one day attack them. In the year ending March 2022, almost 120,000 stalking offences were reported to the police, but less than 6,000 of those reports resulted in a charge rate of just 5% compared to 7% the year before. Does the Solicitor General think that's good enough?
Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Lady for her warm welcome to me as well as to the Attorney General as well. And she's right to raise this issue. I would gently point out that stalking was in fact created an offence under this government, and I pay tribute to my predecessor as Solicitor General, my Right Honourable friend, the member for Cheltenham, in all his work in this area. She is right to highlight that the prosecution rates and the charge rates are not high enough. She will have seen from the action plan that I've referred to that we're determined to see that increase, and the Attorney General and I keep a very close eye on this.
I thank the Solicitor General for that answer, and I appreciate the seriousness with which he approaches these issues. But as he will know, a formal complaint has been submitted by the Susie Lampu Trust and 20 other members of the Anti-Stalking Consortium, asking for an investigation into the overall handling of stalking cases. Whatever the outcome of that process, can I ask the Solicitor General to take on board the recommendations that the consortium has submitted alongside their complaint and ensure that at every level of the criminal justice system, stalking is treated with the seriousness it deserves?
May I pay tribute to the Right Honourable Lady for the tone that she is striking. She is absolutely right to highlight this issue. The Attorney and I will look at that incredibly closely, of course, and we will do exactly as she has said.
We now come to SNP spokesperson Angela Crawley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also take this opportunity to welcome the Attorney General to her place? A commitment to protecting women and girls should mean protecting all women and girls. Safeguards protecting against gender-based violence must be extended to migrant women. What representations has the Attorney-General made to the Home Office to ensure that migrant women are offered the same protections as other women in the UK, and to ratify the Istanbul Convention fully and without reservations?
Mr. Speaker, I know that my right honourable friend, the Attorney General, will be very grateful for the Shadow Minister's welcome. The truth is that the Attorney General works incredibly closely with the Home Office on this issue, and more broadly in relation to victims, works incredibly closely with the Home Office and with the Ministry of Justice. It is not in isolation, but it is with these three departments that we can make progress.
Leon Hart.
Please, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with your permission, I will group questions 2, 3 and 12 together. Since we enacted the Nationality and Borders Act at the end of June, prosecutions for illegal entry and facilitating illegal entry have increased by 250%. We're working across government to ensure that we can stop the life-threatening crossings and prosecute the gangs behind them.
Sir Leon Hart.
Mr. Speaker, organised illegal immigration crime is transnational, making collaboration across Europe vital in tackling people smuggling from source to transit to destination. What steps is my right honourable friend taking to work with partners across Europe to share intelligence and resources to ensure intensive collaborative working between the police and prosecutors.
Tom Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I share the great anger and frustration that many people in Gedling feel about the small boats issue and the traffickers behind them. What assurance can my right honourable friend give me that frontline operatives are collaborating on the investigation and the prosecution of pilots of small boats?
My honourable friend makes an excellent point that I would like to reassure him that the CPS is working extremely closely with Border Force and immigration colleagues to tackle this really dangerous offending. The Solicitor and the Immigration Minister and I recently met a group of such colleagues and were very impressed by their determination to work together.
Rick Campbell.
Speaker, I received an answer to a parliamentary question just a few weeks ago that indicated that over the past 7 years we have paid the French authorities £300 million to try and stop people coming from France to this country illegally. Does the Minister think that was value for money?
Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, it is very important that we work very closely with the French authorities to make sure that prosecutions can take place on both sides of the channel and that we stamp out this illegal activity.
Jim Shaw.
Mr. Speaker, in November the PSNI raided 27 brothels in Northern Ireland and what is described as the biggest operation against people trafficking they have ever carried out to date. The organised crime group was smuggling people into both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. What discussions has the Minister had in relation to trafficking in Northern Ireland with the PSNI, and will the Minister confirm time to tackling this UK-wide problem with those PSNI in Northern Ireland? Thank you.
The honourable gentleman always raises important questions in this chamber, and he does so again today. It's important that prosecutors have been working closely with all law enforcement agencies to provide early advice in modern slavery cases, which has itself led to an increase in evidence-led prosecutions. I look forward to working with him more closely on this in the future.
Scott Benton. Not here, but can we answer the question?
Of course, Mr. Speaker. I've recently met with frontline prosecutors in Bristol, Devon and London to see firsthand the work being undertaken to tackle the backlog of cases. The CPS has created a national surge team that could be deployed to any region across England and Wales to relieve casework pressures.
Shadow Solicitors General Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I also welcome the new Attorney General? But the backlog is still going up. Last week, a solicitor was jailed for 12 years for a £10 million fraud after a private prosecution brought because the CPS took no action. Last year, the prosecution rate for fraud, the most commonly experienced crime, was 0.5%, and the Serious Fraud Office has averaged 4 prosecutions for the past 5 years. Is the Attorney General's solution to the backlog not to prosecute cases at all? And isn't this a pathetic record of inaction by a government that's gone soft on crime?
Mr. Speaker, I disagree with the honourable gentleman in his last two statements. We all want to see the backlogs reduced as quickly as possible, and the Ministry of Justice is leading the development of a cross-government Crown Court recovery plan. And it's through things like technology, through sentencing blitzes and through pre-trial case resolution hearings that we can help reduce the backlog.
Daniel Sykeman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The police in Cambridge have raised with me the time they spend on preparing cases for the CPS, but it's also been suggested that simple tweaks to data protection laws and the information recorded on the Registry of Judgment could make a real difference. Has the Attorney General considered any of these simple steps?
Speaker, I've had several meetings with both the CPS and the police, and it's important that they both work together. For example, in rape and RASO prosecutions, it's important that early advice is sought and that cooperation is seen between the police and the CPS. On disclosure issues more widely, that's something that the Attorney and I are looking at very closely.
Chair of the Committee, Sir Bob Neal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And may I, both personally and on behalf of the Justice Committee, warmly welcome the Attorney to her place. Everybody that saw her sworn in will know how positive the reaction of bar and bench was to her appointment as someone who takes her responsibilities very seriously indeed. And we look forward to working with her. The Director of Public Prosecutions gave evidence to the Justice Committee last month and stressed that the pressures upon the CPS have to be seen in the context of the justice system as a whole, and that the solution to those pressures requires consistent support for the system, but in particular support for CPS staff.
Come on, somebody answer it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and that pleasure falls to me. And I am grateful to my honourable friend for his kind words, as I know the Attorney is as well. And he's right to highlight the words of the Director, Mr. Speaker, and he will know that the Attorney and I work very closely with the Director of Public Prosecutions, and we listen very carefully to what he says.
Kevin Foster.
Question number 5, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, in the vast majority of cases, judges get sentencing right. The Court of Appeal will only grant permission to refer a sentence in exceptional circumstances, and over the last 5 years, the Court of Appeal has increased the sentence in around 70% of cases.
Ian Foster.
And the Solicitor General for his answer. Here we are. The recent publication of statistics regarding the operation of the unduly lenient sentencing scheme during 2021 indicated 151 referrals to the Court of Appeal. How many of those referrals under the scheme followed representations from the victim of a crime to the Attorney General's office about the sentence given, and what is being done to ensure victims are aware of their ability to do so?
Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for his question, who knows a lot about the scheme and has a long-term interest in it. Of those 151 cases, only 8 were referred by victims and a further 9 by a member of victims' family. And that's not just an aberration for that year, that is a consistent trend. We do regularly publish updates on the outcome of these sentences, and of course the revised Victims Code includes details of the ULS scheme.
Gavin Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Solicitor General recognise that whenever people in this country try to have a debate around mandatory minimum sentences, there's an automatic superficial reaction that talks about the need for judicial discretion, and yet there are crimes for which we as Parliament should be very clear as to the appropriate sentence that people ought to expect?
Just remind members not to walk in front of other Mary Kelly Foy. You walk right in front of the member as he was asking a question and said, please, if we could all wait to help each other.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman who always raises a serious point in relation to these issues. It is right to acknowledge that in the vast majority of cases the sentencing judges get it right, but where Parliament sets down what the guidelines and the ambits, they should be followed very closely.
Right, Alan Brown.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to take this opportunity of thanking the opposition front bench and the chairman of the Justice Select Committee for their extremely kind comments. With your permission, I'll answer questions 6 and 7 together. I welcome the ruling of the Supreme Court. The court was very clear, it was a unanimous decision, that a bill legislating for a referendum on Scottish independence is not within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That might be a case of the Supreme Court, but if we look back, John Major said of Scotland that no nation could be held irrevocably in a union against its will. So will she confirm if Scotland is in a voluntary union, and if so, what's the legal mechanism to affirm that, or more importantly, the legal means by which Scotland can voluntarily leave this union?
Mr. Speaker, the UK Supreme Court was very clear that an independence referendum was related to reserved matters, and the government welcomes the court's confirmation of this point. What the people of Scotland want is to see the government working with them to solve the issues that matter to them.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and good morning. Mr. Speaker, following the recent Supreme Court judgment, the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Scotland have been asked on numerous occasions what is the democratic route available to Scotland to leave the Union, but neither have been able to provide an answer. Mr. Speaker, if the people of England wanted to leave this alleged voluntary union of equals, what democratic process is available to them?
Mr. Speaker, I believe that I've answered this question already, and I heard myself, the Prime Minister, answer it several times in the course of Prime Minister's questions. The Supreme Court rejected the Lord Advocate's submissions that an advisory referendum would only have an indirect and consequential effect on the reserved matter. This matter is reserved.
Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the Supreme Court's judgment will also have the unexpected side effect in that it will force the Scottish Government to actually concentrate on domestic policy for once?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. I agree that the people of Scotland want us to work together to fix the challenges that we face collectively, and now is the time to make sure that we work together, and that's what this government will do.
David Dewey. Question number 9, please, Mr. Speaker.
I am so sorry, Mr. Speaker. The government stands with Ukraine as it defends itself from Russia's invasion. I am personally extremely committed to this, and frankly my home life wouldn't be worth living if I weren't. We are working closely with the Ukrainian Prosecutor General, Andrei Kostin, as he presents Russia's crimes in the Ukrainian courts. The UK, US and EU Atrocity Advisory Group is helping him, as is Sir Howard Morrison. We've provided a package of financial support for the International Criminal Court, and we stand ready to do whatever else is required.
David Dewey. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I join others in welcoming my right honourable friend to her post? And can I ask my right honourable friend what's her assessment of the international community's response to the alleged war crimes being committed in Ukraine?
Mr. Speaker, the international community is determined to support Ukraine's search for justice. Last week, I attended a meeting of the G7 justice ministers in Berlin, which focused on this. These are difficult issues to address, and it will take time and careful international working to overcome the perspectives and preferences of individual states.
Emmy Stone.
Mr. Speaker, it is clearly hugely important that those who commit war crimes are brought to justice. I wonder if the Minister would agree with me that it's hugely important that the maximum publicity is given, perhaps via social media, to those who have committed these crimes, to shame them.
The honourable gentleman makes a really important point. This is a very unusual situation. We are prosecuting war crimes, or the Ukrainians are prosecuting war crimes, in real time, and we hope that the news of those prosecutions, the 13 Russian soldiers who are already convicted and in prison as a result, will permeate through the Russian ranks and will itself stop them committing war crimes in this terrible war.
There's twist.
Question 11, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I'll answer questions 11 and 13 together. Last year, the CPS prosecuted 7,200 defendants where fraud and forgery were the principal offence, and the conviction rate was 84.1%. This financial year, the SFO has successfully prosecuted 4 fraudsters, as well as Glencore, which resulted in the highest ever order in a corporate criminal conviction in the UK.
There's twist.
Mr. Speaker, according to the latest Home Office data, there were almost 940,000 fraud offences, but only around 4,800 of them, of those offences, resulted in charges or summonses. The exact charge rate was just 0.51%, even lower than the rate for the previous year. Can I ask the Attorney General why he thinks the rate for fraud is so abysmally low, and what he plans to do about it?
Mr. Speaker, the figures for last year were in fact that the CPS prosecuted 7,200 defendants where fraud and forgery were the principal offence, and it is right to say that 84.1% was the conviction rate, and in April of this year the CPS launched a united team, and the new Serious Economic Organised Crime and International Directorate has been set up, which will help in this regard.
Brenda Shaw.
Simple fact of life that you cannot tackle a problem if you don't know the scale and nature of what you are dealing with. So does the Attorney General agree with me that the government needs urgent answers to 3 basic questions? What is the total scale of fraud in the UK? How much of it is being perpetrated from overseas? And how much of it represents organized crime? And is she able to give us any of these answers today?
Mr. Speaker, both the CPS and the SFO play a significant role in tackling fraud and economic crime, and we shouldn't gloss over the successes that there have been. And, Mr. Speaker, once again, I do pay tribute to the SFO for their successful prosecution of Glencore, which resulted in a £280 million total payment, the highest ever that has been ordered in a corporate criminal conviction in the United Kingdom.
Order, order. I have a short statement to make. His Majesty the King is visiting Parliament next Wednesday. Between 3:15 and 3:45, the sitting of both houses will be temporarily suspended. His Majesty will be unveiling a plaque in Westminster Hall and then unveiling and switching on the Platinum Jubilee gift from members of both houses in New Palashard. Members wishing to attend either location should email Blackrod's office by 4 p.m. tomorrow. Before we come to Prime Minister's questions, I would like to point out that the British Sign Language interpretation proceedings is available to watch on Parliament Live TV. We start with questions to the Prime Minister. Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the United Kingdom in its current form turned 100 years old. But neither the Prime Minister nor the leader of the Labour Party seem to recognise the challenge of the Supreme Court ruling as to the very nature of the Union. He didn't answer me 2 weeks ago, so can the Prime Minister clarify if he still believes the UK is a voluntary union? And if so, can he explain the democratic route by which the people of Scotland can choose whether to stay in it or not?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we fully respect the decision of the Supreme Court and believe strongly in the United Kingdom. And as I said to the Honourable Lady last time, we will work constructively with the Scottish Government to deliver for the people of Scotland.
Anthony Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Financial scams are the most common form of crime, causing immense emotional and financial distress to millions of people. And government efforts in this matter have tended to focus on making sure that scammers can't launder their proceeds of crime and that victims get compensation. Both of those are really important, but they're acting after the scams happened. Does my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, agree with me that government departments, regulators and industry, perhaps guided by an anti-scams task force, could do far more to stop scams happening in the first place? And will he meet with me to talk about this?
Working closely with industry to block more fraudulent calls from reaching the public. Ads, I would be happy to meet with my honourable friend to discuss further.
We know.
Start by welcoming the new member. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative. What changed?
Mr. Speaker, let me start by also welcoming the Honourable Lady to her place. Now, the Honourable Gentleman comes here every week, and I know he's focused on the process and the politics, but I don't think he's actually taken the time to read the detail of what we are doing to improve our planning system. So let me just explain what we are doing. We are, Mr. Speaker, we are protecting the green belt. We are investing millions to develop brownfield sites. And we're providing support and protection for local neighbourhood plans. Just this morning, the Shadow Housing Secretary said, communities should have control over where homes are built and what sort of homes are built. That's my position, that's her position. What's his position?
Mr. Speaker, does he really expect us to believe that the member for Chipping Barton and the member for the Isle of Wight are cheering him on because he's going to build more homes? Pull the other one. I'll tell him what changed. His backbenchers threatened him. And as always, the blancmange Prime Minister wobbled. He did a grubby deal with a handful of his MPs and sold out the aspirations of those who want to own their own home. Was it worth it?
Mr. Speaker, as ever, engaging in the petty personality politics, not focused on the substance. Again, let me explain what we're doing. We're delivering what I said we would do. We're protecting the character of local communities. We're cracking down on land banking and irresponsible developers. And we're giving people a greater say in their decisions. Just this week, Mr. Speaker, on Monday, the Honourable Gentleman said the government should be giving people more power and control. Now he seems to be opposing that policy. It's only Wednesday. I know he flip-flops, but even for him it's pretty quick.
Mr. Speaker, he's forgotten. Last week I offered him Labour votes to pass these housing targets because this is bigger than politics. The former Housing Secretary on their side said scrapping mandatory targets would, this is his words from their side of the House, be a colossal failure of political leadership. No wonder he doesn't want to fight the next election, Mr. Speaker. The author of the manifesto that they all stood on said it would cut building by 40%, perhaps even more. Why would he rather cripple house building than work with us to get those targets through?
Mr. Speaker, we're not going to work with the Labour Party on housing. You know why? We'll have a look at their record on housing. In London, the former Conservative mayor in 5 years built 60,000 affordable homes. The current Labour mayor, half of that amount. In Wales, we want to build 12,000 homes. What are Labour delivering? Half of that, Mr. Speaker. The Labour Party talks, the Conservatives deliver.
Mr. Speaker, as ever, too weak to stand up to his own side on behalf of the country. Mr. Speaker, I noticed there was another U-turn last night, this time on wind farms. Actually, I agree with that one, but is there no issue on which he won't give in to his backbenchers? Now, Mr. Speaker, how did his colleague, Baroness Mone, end up with nearly £30 million of taxpayers' money in her bank account?
Mr. Speaker, let me say, like everyone else, I was absolutely shocked to read about the allegation. It's absolutely right. It's absolutely right that she is no longer attending the House of Lords and therefore no longer has the Conservative whip. Again, the one thing we know about the Honourable Gentleman, he is a lawyer. He should know there's a process in place. It's right that that process concludes. I hope that it's resolved promptly. But I'll say one thing, Mr. Speaker, because I tell him what is weak. I tell him what is weak is not being able to. I'll tell him, and that's not being able to stand up to people. I know he's taken some advice from Gordon Brown lately. Why doesn't he listen to a former minister in Gordon Brown's government who just said, why does the Labour Party refuse to stand up for workers in businesses like pubs and restaurants who will lose business as a result of the train strikes? Labour should stand up for working people. If he's strong, that's what he should do.
Mr. Speaker, it may not seem like it, but he's supposed to be the Prime Minister. This morning, his Transport Secretary said that his flagship legislation on strikes, this is what he said this morning, his Transport Secretary, might want to listen to this, is clearly not going to help with the industrial action we're facing. He should stop grandstanding, stop sitting on his hands, get round the table and resolve these issues. And everyone can see what's happening here. A Tory politician got their hands on hundreds of millions in taxpayers' money and then provided Duff PPE, and he says he's shocked. He was the Chancellor. He signed the cheques. How much is he going to get back?
Mr. Speaker, it's right that he brought up legislation with regard to strikes, and I'm very happy to address it, actually. So, hard-working families right now in this country are facing challenges. The government has been reasonable. It's accepted the recommendations of an independent pay body, giving pay rises in many cases higher than the private sector. But if the union leaders to continue to be unreasonable, then it is my duty to take action to protect the lives and livelihoods of the British public. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, since I became Prime Minister, I have been working for new, tough laws to protect people from this disruption. That's the legislation he's asking about. Will he now confirm that he'll stand up for working people and that he and his party will back that legislation?
Mr. Speaker, he's obviously not heard what his Transport Secretary said about that legislation this morning. And it's obvious why they're so opposed to Labour's plans to clean up Westminster. They all voted for tax rises for working people, while one of their unelected peers pocketed millions flogging dodgy PPE.
Should be ashamed.
Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to raise something that is worrying parents across the country. Our hearts go out to the families of the children who've tragically died from the outbreak of Strep A in recent weeks. I'm very happy to work with the government on this. So can he take the opportunity to update the country on the measures the country is taking to keep children safe this winter?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my thoughts are, of course, with the families of the children who have sadly lost their lives. We are seeing a higher number of cases from Strep A this year compared to usual. What I can say is that the NHS, who I have sat down to talk about this, are working very hard to make sure parents are aware of the symptoms that they should be looking out to, because this can be treated appropriately with antibiotics. There are no current shortages of drugs available to treat this, and there are well-established procedures in place to ensure that that remains the case. And the UK SHA are monitoring the situation at pace, and what they have confirmed is that there this is not a new strain of strep A, so people should be reassured about that. There is no reason to believe that it's become more lethal or more resistant to antibiotics. So the most important thing for parents to do is look out for the symptoms and get the treatment that is available for them.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Airbnb-type short-term lets provide a positive experience for many holidaymakers, but too many cause real issues for local communities. In Westminster, we have 13,000 Airbnb properties alone. Does my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, agree with me that it is now time to consider a registration scheme managed by local authorities so councils can properly manage this growing sector?
My right honourable friend, the Levelling Up Secretary, has indeed said that we will deliver a new tourist accommodation registration scheme, something I know my honourable friend has asked for. It will increase appropriate regulation of the sector, better understand and monitor the impact on local communities, and we will also consult on whether planning permissions should be required for new short-term holiday lets, especially in tourist hotspots.
Can I welcome the new leader of the SNP and thank you, Blackford, previously. Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to begin by paying tribute to my friend and colleague, the Right Honourable Member for Ross Skye and Lochaber, who has served us with diligence and duty for the last 5 years. Mr. Speaker, he is a giant of the Scottish independence movement. Mr. Speaker, he's seen off not one, not two, but 3 consecutive Tory Prime Ministers. Indeed, he was on to his 4th in recent weeks. And to that latest Prime Minister, I have a very simple question. What does he consider to be the greatest achievement of the Conservative Party in government since 2019? Leaving the single market and customs union, ending freedom of movement, denying Scotland her democracy, or getting the Labour Party to agree with all of the above?
Mr. Speaker, can I start by offering my genuine and warm, heartfelt best wishes to the Right Honourable Member for Ross Skye and Lochaber. I know the whole House will miss his weekly contributions. And may I also congratulate or join the First Minister in congratulating the Honourable Gentleman on his appointment as a Westminster leader of the SNP. I look forward to a constructive debate with him across the dispatch box. Mr. Speaker, the answer to his question is actually very simple. The things that we are most proud of in the last couple of years is making sure that we protected this country through the pandemic with furlough and with the fastest vaccine rollout.
Mr. Speaker, far be it for me to offer advice to a near billionaire, but he's going to have to up his game. And here's why, because in the last 15 minutes, a poll has landed which shows that support for Scottish independence has now hit 56%. And support for the Scottish National Party sits north of 50%. So in that context, can I ask the Prime Minister, does he consider that increasing energy bills on households in energy-rich Scotland by a further £500 will cause those poll numbers to rise or to fall?
Well, Mr. Speaker, what we're delivering for households across the United Kingdom, including those in Scotland, is £55 billion of support with energy bills. It will save a typical homeowner about £900 under their bills this winter, with extra support for the most vulnerable. And that is, Mr. Speaker, an example of the United Kingdom and the Union delivering for people in Scotland.
David Morris. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Eden Project North is now getting right to the end of the process. It's gone through right to the levelling up stage 2. It has planning permission, it has land allocation, it has everything that's going to offer the north of England. Prime Minister, when are we going to be getting the Eden Project North?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend, I think the whole House knows my honourable friend has been a passionate campaigner for Eden North for some time. I was pleased to work with him in my previous role. He knows I can't comment on any specific bid, but I know that the Secretary of State will be making these decisions by the end of the year, and I wish him and everyone involved in the project every success.
Stephen Flynn. Most people and businesses in Northern Ireland accept the need for the protocol and want to see negotiated, pragmatic solutions to the various challenges. While there has been a clear improvement in the mood music between the UK and the European Union over recent weeks, there is a growing frustration and concern at the slow rate of actual progress in those talks. So what steps can the Prime Minister take to inject some momentum into those negotiations? And indeed, can I encourage him to visit Northern Ireland as soon as possible, preferably before Christmas, to engage with local stakeholders around the protocol and also to hear views on how the Assembly can be restored via reform?
Well, can I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and I enjoyed meeting him recently to discuss these issues. Let me give him and the people of Northern Ireland my assurance that I want to see the issues with the protocol resolved as quickly as possible. I do believe that if people enter into these talks that we are having in a spirit of goodwill and pragmatism, that we can indeed find a way through. My right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary and Vice President Šefčovič, are in regular dialogue, and I will take on board his suggestion to come visit Northern Ireland to discuss these things in person.
Darren Henry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We just had Small Business Saturday, where we marked the important impact small businesses have on our local communities. I, like many of my colleagues, have spoken to these businesses and heard just how great their concerns are for their future. When the Prime Minister was Chancellor earlier this year, he went with me to Fred Hallam in Beeston, a business established in 1908. SMEs such as this face their pandemic and now rising energy costs. Can the Prime Minister lay out how he will ensure businesses such as Fred Hallam will be supported in the coming months so that they may thrive and continue to provide vital goods and services to my constituents in Broxton?
Thank you. Well, I know my honourable friend is a fantastic champion of his local businesses. It was a privilege to visit Beeston and Hallam's earlier this year with him, and I remember we discussed then some of the things we were planning to do, which are now going to make a big difference, saving businesses hundreds or thousands of pounds with their energy bills through our relief scheme this winter, our business rates tax cuts package worth over $13 billion, particularly impacting retail businesses, and with initiatives like the annual investment allowance and Help to Grow, we can take his small businesses to a whole new level. I look forward to working with him on that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A recent set for the Select Committees, both the author of the government's own National Food Strategy and the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to food, a call for universal free school meals to address the issue of the 4 million children hungry in the UK. Will the Prime Minister meet with me to discuss how investments in universal free school meals will benefit children and their families in Liverpool, West Derby and the country, and at no extra cost to the taxpayer?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know this is an issue on which the honourable gentleman has campaigned for some time, and he's right to highlight the importance of making sure our children have access to food. That's why I'm proud that we introduced not just an expansion of free school meals, but also the holiday activity and food programme. I'm always interested in more ideas where we can go further. I look forward to hearing from him.
Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whether on defence with AUKUS, trade with CPTPP, or diplomacy with ASEAN, I know this government recognises the importance of the Indo-Pacific to the UK's security and prosperity, but the challenges that exist, whether they are ballistic missile tests or the Belt and Road, are deeply interconnected. So can the Prime Minister confirm that the Indo-Pacific remains a UK priority and that he will take a holistic approach within government to meet the challenges and capture the opportunities that exist in the region?
Well, Mr. Speaker, last year's integrated review set out our Indo-Pacific tilt with regard to foreign policy. I reaffirmed this government's commitment to that tilt in a speech at the Lord Mayor's dinner just the other week, and he's right to highlight both the economic and security importance of the region. He should be reassured that we're pursuing not just free trade agreements bilaterally, but also CPTPP, the AUKUS partnership, and indeed, hopefully, a new partnership with regard to our future combat air system, all evidence that we are delivering on the tilt.
Siobhan MacDonagh.
Mr. Speaker, members across this House know the devastating impact of bank branch closures on our communities. But as banks flee the high streets, our free cash machines disappear with them, hitting the most vulnerable hardest. Surely it cannot be right that a quarter of ATMs charge people to access their own money. So will the Prime Minister join dozens of his own backbenchers today in backing my cross-party amendment and ensure that everyone has free access to their hard-earned money?
Well, Mr. Speaker, this government is indeed legislating to safeguard access to cash, and that's what the Financial Services and Markets Bill this afternoon will do through a very significant intervention. I'm also pleased that we put in place initiatives with the industry to subsidise free-to-use ATMs in deprived areas, and almost 50 communities are benefiting from our new shared cash facilities, because access to cash is important, and that's what our new bill will deliver.
Manchester.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the government's commitment to its hospital buildings programme. Can the Prime Minister clarify what criteria will be applied for the allocation of those new hospitals? And will it be done in line with the Prime Minister's personal commitment on a merits-based system of government? Because my hospital in Medway serves 500,000 people and is the busiest hospital A&E in Kent. We have some of the highest health inequalities in the country. We were one of the hardest hit areas in Medway during COVID-19. We need our fair share allocation of resources in Medway. Will the Prime Minister visit Medway Hospital with me and fellow local MPs to look at our urgent need?
Well, my honourable friend is a fantastic champion for his local area, but especially for his local hospital. He'll know that I can't comment on any specific scheme, but I can tell him that submissions to be one of the new hospitals are currently being reviewed in the department, and an announcement will be made shortly.
Mary Killifoy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Small Business Saturday, I was delighted to name Daisy Rose Coffee House as the City of Durham's Small Business of the Year 2022 after a public vote in my inaugural award. But like so many small businesses, Daisy Rose Coffee House is the beating heart of the local community and the cornerstone in their high street. But so many business owners that I meet with feel utterly ignored by the government as they're clobbered by outdated business rates year after year. The government must pick a side. Are they going to continue to back the online giants, or will they join the Labour Party and back small business and scrap and replace the outdated business rates?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I congratulate Daisy Rose for winning their award and being the beating heart of their high street. I very much hope that they will benefit, and I'm almost certain they will, from our discounts on business rates. Our retail, hospitality and leisure relief gives a 75% discount on business rates in the next financial year, and that comes on top of the support that we'll be providing Daisy Rose and others with their energy bills, with bills being about half of what they would have otherwise been without our support.
Conor Barnes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, can I thank you and colleagues across the House for your kindness and encouragement in recent weeks. Can I ask my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, this afternoon to recommit the government he leads to our ambition of levelling up communities in every part of our great United Kingdom? And to that end, could I invite my right honourable friend to come and visit my Bournemouth West constituency and see the latest school rebuild, the multi-million-pound rebuild of the Oak Academy, which will stand as a lasting tribute of opportunity to the people I have the privilege of serving in this House.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I say that it's very nice to hear from my right honourable friend today, and he's absolutely right. There is no better way to spread opportunity around the country than by investing in our children's future. I'm absolutely delighted that Oak Academy in his constituency is benefiting from our school rebuilding programme, and I will certainly ask my office to keep his kind invitation in mind.
Alan Doran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've raised this matter before, but despite meeting with a previous Prime Minister in 2020, this matter has not progressed. In 1984, I was a serving police officer in Metropolitan Police when, on the 17th of April, WPC Yvonne Fletcher was shot in the back and killed whilst policing a political demonstration outside the Libyan embassy. No Justice, Mr. Justice Spencer said, PC Yvonne Fletcher on the doctrine of common design. Will the Prime Minister meet with me to see how this case may be taken forward and finally bring those responsible for the murder of Yvonne to justice in a criminal court?
Oh, can I thank the honourable gentleman for his continued work on this case. As he said, it's something that he has raised before. He'll appreciate that while I can't speak in detail on any particular case, there are differences in the standard of proof required for civil and criminal proceedings. That said, the CPS will consider any new information that is referred to them by the police in relation to this case, and of course, I'd be very happy to meet with him.
Jackie Doyle-Price.
Returning to the theme of communities being able to decide where to build, in Thurrock we embrace our obligations to deliver more new homes, and at Arena Essex we have an application to deliver 2,500 new homes ready to go. However, there is a standing objection to any development over 300 homes from National Highways because of the impact on Junction 30 of the M25. Could I ask my right honourable friend what advice he gives to Thurrock Council as to how they can deliver their housing obligations with this national constraint?
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for her question, and she highlights a great example of a council that is trying to do the right thing and put the right homes in the right places. They should have our support. If I'd ask her, please, to write to my right honourable friend, the Levelling Up Secretary, with the details of the issue so we can give her a full response, but praise her council to trying to make sure that we can build the homes where we need them.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Why can't the government process asylum claims within 6 months, thereby saving £5.6 million a day? The abuse of the system, which currently has a backlog of 147,000 asylum claims.
Mr. Speaker, what we are doing is significantly increasing the number of caseworkers. We are on course to double it by next spring, with several hundred already in place. And she is right that the process takes longer than it should. Often, that is because people are able to exploit some of the rules in our system and make sequential claims. That is exactly what we do.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There have been more reported deaths and adverse reactions following mRNA vaccination in 18 months than there has been to every who are breastfeeding. Would my right honourable friend overturn the Big Pharma-funded MHRA's recent recommendation that these experimental vaccines are administered to children as young as 6 months of age?
Mr. Speaker, let me first say that I believe COVID vaccines are indeed safe and effective. No vaccine, COVID or otherwise, will be approved unless it meets the UK regulator standards of safety, quality and effectiveness. We have an independent body. The JCVI determines which age groups the vaccine is recommended for use in as part of the vaccination programme, and of course the ultimate decision will lie with parents.
Kevin Bladden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During COVID, we all applauded our NHS nurses who put their lives on the line to help millions of our constituents and our loved ones. But we now know that at the same time, Tory spivs were helping themselves, using their connections and COVID to help themselves to millions of pounds of public money. Why is the Prime Minister on the side of the spivs and not on the side of the nurses?
Mr. Speaker, what everyone was doing at the time was working as hard and as quickly as they could to get the PPE to get the PPE needed for our frontline workers, including our nurses. Actually, there was an independent procurement process. Ministers were not involved in the decision-making, but it was right, Mr. Speaker, but that people gave their ideas about where to get them from. Indeed, the Shadow Chancellor herself suggested that we should get PPE from a law firm. She suggested we should get ventilators from a football agent. Everyone was trying as hard as they can. We should remember the context and stop playing politics.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 weeks ago, more than 350 people attended a meeting in Skegness to discuss the use of 5 seafront hotels to house asylum seekers. They were united in their view that there was a long-term economic impact and a pressure on public services. They told me loud and clear that, like the Prime Minister, they think hotels are the wrong place for asylum seekers. Does he agree with me that the government needs urgently to lay out a plan that moves beyond the use of hotels, puts asylum seekers in the right place for them and the right place for coastal communities such as those in Skegness?
I completely agree with my honourable friend that we are now spending £6 million a day housing asylum seekers. Hotels are incredibly expensive. We will urgently bring forward proposals to reduce the pressure, but as he knows as I know, the best way to solve this problem sustainably is to reduce the number of illegal migrants coming to the United Kingdom, and that's what this government will deliver.
Chris Elmore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Audit Wales has confirmed that the Welsh Labour government responded well and got on with the job of delivering value for taxpayers' money. Can the Prime Minister tell the House what first attracted him to awarding £1 billion of COVID contracts to Tory donors and supporters, and what is he doing to claw taxpayers' money back?
Again, Mr. Speaker, we delivered 32 billion pieces of PPE to the front line at a time when there was a global shortage. As I've already said, everyone tried to do their bit. We heard recommendations from the Shadow Chancellor, but it was right that hers and everyone else's suggestions went through an independent process where ministers were not involved in the decisions.
Robin Walker.
Josh McAllister's independent review of children's social care has been with the government since May, and I understand there's been some disappointment that the response to it won't be published before Christmas. But can the Prime Minister ensure, given the very important recommendations about some of the most vulnerable children in our society and the families who support them, the people who support them, that there will be a strong and robust government response as early as possible in the new year?
Yes, my honourable friend obviously knows this subject area well. He's right to highlight the importance of making sure that we do provide good quality support to vulnerable children. The report has a lot of interesting suggestions in it, and he's right, and I can commit to him, we will respond in due course.
Final question, Claire Hanna.
Thank you very much. Prime Minister, over 70% of Northern Ireland's international tourists arrive to Dublin and travel across the land border. The UK government's proposed electronic travel authorisation would likely mean the North being struck off the itinerary of operators and many independent travellers. And the last thing we need is a barrier to one of our biggest economic drivers, to say nothing of the impact on non-Irish and British people living in Ireland. Members from across the House have acknowledged that our border isn't a normal one. Will the Prime Minister commit to scrapping this unworkable proposal?
Mr. Speaker, I can give the Honourable Lady my assurance that we remain very committed to the common travel area and indeed do not want to see any checks on the island of Ireland, and that's why we're working very hard to resolve the issues with the protocol and ensure Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom.
Obviously, it's not Huddersfield. Right, let us go on to the urgent question. Urgent question, Dame Margaret Hodge. Margaret Hodge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Urgent question to ask the Chancellor of the Exchequer if he'll make a statement on the continued involvement by UK companies in Russia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I am grateful to the Right Honourable Lady for her question. The UK and international partners have moved in lockstep since the invasion to impose the largest and most severe economic sanctions that Russia has ever faced, designating more than 1,200 individuals and over 120 entities. This includes a ban on new outward investments in Russia and £18.4 billion of Russian frozen assets reported to the government, Mr. Speaker. And on Monday, in alignment with coalition partners, we banned the import of Russian oil and oil products into our markets. And in conjunction with partners, we have prohibited UK ships and services from the maritime transportation of Russian oil unless the price paid is at or below $60. The government does not comment on individual commercial decisions, and the process of divesting from Russia will be complicated for companies who need to ensure compliance with financial sanctions. However, since Russia's illegal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, we've seen commitments from many firms and investors to divest from Russian assets. Finally, Mr. Speaker, the government has been clear that we support further signals of intent to divest from Russian assets. In March this year, the then Chancellor, now Prime Minister, welcomed commitments made by a number of firms to divest from Russian assets and noted that he supports further signals of intent and said that there is no case for new investment in Russia. That remains the government's position.
Demora Hodge.
Mr. Speaker, I thank you very much indeed for granting this urgent question, and I thank the Minister for his reply. But I'd simply say to him, listening to the reply, the government has constantly talked about taking back control. If there's one issue that they should take back control on, it is this, of ensuring that no British company invests in Russia. Today, Mr. Speaker, is the 286th day of Putin's invasion into the Ukraine. In February, 3 days after the war started, BP said, and I quote, it will exit its 19.75% shareholding in Rosneft, Russia's main oil company. Despite this promise, BP remains one of the largest shareholders. And according to the excellent research by Global Witness, they are set to receive £580 million in dividends on the back of bumper profits fuelled by the war. Does the Minister agree with me that it is utterly shameful that a large, publicly listed British company profits from the sale of oil that is funding Putin's war? Does he further agree with the words of Mr. Yushchenko, President Zelensky's economic advisor, who wrote to BP and said, "This is blood money, pure and simple, inflated profits made from the murder of Ukrainian civilians." BP's claim that it is locked in as a shareholder is both laughable and easily solved. To put it into perspective, BP's dividends are equivalent to over 1/4 of the total military and humanitarian aid provided by the UK government to Ukraine. Does the Minister agree with Mr. Yushchenko that BP and any other company still invested in Russia's fossil fuels must donate the entirety of their wartime profits to the victims of that war? Does he further agree that it is our duty to ensure that companies are not damaging Britain's national interests? Will this government therefore work to persuade BP to donate the entirety of its Russian dividends to the reconstruction of Ukraine? And if this fails, will he commit to act and force them to do so through a special windfall tax?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Lady. And if I may say and put on record, I recognise she has had a long-standing record of holding governments to account on these issues, on sanctions, on international finance. I was previously Minister of Justice when we had the SLAPS issue. She has been very active and including across party lines. So I pay tribute to her on that. In terms of her specific questions, I do entirely understand, Mr. Speaker, why people feel as strongly as they do on this subject. I feel strongly. It's appalling what Putin has done. It's appalling what Putin has done in Ukraine. But I am not going to comment on a specific UK companies or taxpayers or their commercial decisions. What I would say to the Right Honourable Lady and to colleagues is, I've set out the range of measures that we are taking. It is important to stress that whilst we all want to see companies that have committed to divesting doing so, there are, of course, issues presented. Now, I don't say this with specific prejudice to any firm or any individual company, but, for example, I think, Mr. Speaker, were it to be the case, for example, that a firm divesting from Russia, selling its shares, were to sell them in such a way that they returned to an individual entity that was sanctioned, for example, there would be condemnation of that, and rightly so. This is not a straightforward process, and I repeat, I don't say that in reference to any specific company. In terms of her other points, I totally agree that we should be doing everything possible to support the people of Ukraine. I think we can be very proud of the enormous effort we have taken as a country. Varane rightly talked about our duty. I think we have a duty to support them. We are second only to the United States, Mr. Speaker, in the amount of aid we have given to the people of Ukraine, now totalling over £6 million. As I understand it, we've been training their soldiers, 22,000 of them, since 2015. This is a country which has done its bit in relation to Ukraine, and we are proud of that. Of course we want to do more, and we want to go further. That's why we work with our partners. That's why only on Monday, Mr. Speaker, we announced the decision in partnership with G7 states and with Australia in relation to Russian oil, across the piece, a record of taking decisive action, and of course, in terms of the Treasury, the most powerful sanctions on record in relation to Russia. That is hitting their economy. It is hitting their economy. Of course, we have no dispute with the Russian people who will feel the impact of that, but we are doing what we are doing because we're doing everything possible, bar direct military action, to support the people of Ukraine.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
I'm sure the entire House agrees with the Minister that the UK has done a tremendous job in supporting the Ukraine ever since it was illegally invaded. What I think we're looking for here is a way of the government being able to intervene to stop private companies somehow drilling a hole in the bottom of the bucket while we are pouring in water at the top. Is there nothing really that can be done to impound or confiscate or levy a tax against money that has been raised in this unacceptable way?
Obviously, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I pay tribute to his great expertise on these matters. What I would say to him is, I think we have to differentiate here. Obviously, we have taken very explicit and direct action in relation to those firms within the sanctions regime. I think it's 120 entities and 1,200 individuals have been sanctioned. And as I said earlier, £18.4 billion of frozen assets so far reported to the UK government. But I think the distinction here is that in terms of UK businesses or other, indeed, global businesses, these are globally operating businesses, and where they are divesting from Russia, and there's been a clear commitment from a number of important players, and I'm not specifically talking about any one, that we have to recognise there is complexity involved in that. The Prime Minister, when he was Chancellor back in March, was very clear about what we want to see as a government in terms of divestment, and we obviously support companies in taking that action, but I'm happy to look at what further can be done in this space and work with colleagues.
Shadow Minister Pat McFadden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank my right honourable friend, the member for Barking, for tabling this question. Right now in Kyiv, the temperature is around freezing. Putin aims to weaken the resolve of the Ukrainian people by freezing them over this winter. But with every Russian missile that falls on energy infrastructure, he doesn't weaken the resolve of the Ukrainian people, he strengthens it. And the resounding answer to the question posed by President Zelensky, without electricity or without you, should be heard loudly and clearly in Moscow. Now, to support the efforts of the Ukrainian people, many British companies have ceased their Russian operations and divested their interests. And these decisions have cost businesses money and orders and jobs, but they've done it because they want to do the right thing. And other businesses are paying higher energy costs as a result of the war. But some companies either continue to operate or have not fully divested their interests. The excess profits made by energy companies have rightly been called the windfalls of war. Energy is the central pillar of the Russian economy, and the profits from it fuel the Russian war effort. Now, my right honourable friend, the member for Barking, has told the House today that the dividend due to BP as a result of its stake in Rosneft is worth about £580 million. These funds may be frozen at the moment, but what does the government believe should happen to these funds when they are eventually released? Does the government believe that these funds should be used for the welfare and benefit of the people of Ukraine, whose country is being devastated by Russian aggression? And how many other British companies are still operating in Russia, and why are they still operating? What is the government's position on money they could be making there, which could also be described as the windfalls of war? Mr. Speaker, we are united across this House in our support for Ukraine, and for the incredible bravery shown by both its armed forces and its people. But the question the House poses today is how will the government make sure that British companies are not profiting from the appalling Russian aggression that we have seen in Ukraine?
Well, of course, I'm grateful to the gentleman. He poses a number of very important questions. Just on the general point, he talks about strengthening the resolve of the people of Ukraine. I think this country can be rightly proud of every step it's taken to strengthen that resolve. And I must say, on record, the leadership of two former Prime Ministers as well as the current Prime Minister, they showed extraordinary leadership, appearing in Kiev under huge pressure, supporting President Zelensky, and alongside the support we've given in terms of the Ukrainian armed forces and our massive humanitarian aid. And I know there is consensus on this, but we should not in any way be defensive about the steps we have taken to support the Ukrainian people. He talks about companies doing the right thing, and he's absolutely right that companies are divesting from and exiting from Russia. We welcome that. I explained about the statement made by the Prime Minister when he was Chancellor back in March. That's something we obviously welcome. I do think there are some complexities in that process, and I'm not going to be drawn on individual firms. That is long-standing Treasury policy for very good reason. He mentions about a windfall tax. We have a windfall tax on North Sea oil and gas, which will raise £41.6 billion. It's an enormous sum of money. And why are we raising that money? It is in part precisely to fund the extraordinary support that we are putting in place to help British people and British businesses through this winter, because he talks about the impact on companies of Putin's war and the impact on people. Yes, of course, the harshest impact is on the people of Ukraine, not least the bereaved families. But there is an impact on our people. Higher prices here and throughout Europe and the world, higher energy prices, our windfall tax funds that support so that this winter we're doing everything.
There's no doubt that the UK has led the war regime, but this urgent question is about UK companies selling pizza in Russia. That's acceptable. Invest fully rather than just give interviews to and offer warm words.
That we don't entertain specific discussions on individual companies and their commercial interests. But what I would say to him is we've been very clear on the need to divest. We've got an outright ban on investment in Russia, Mr. Speaker. I would sincerely obviously hope that companies aren't abusing that. I'm not going to suggest that the companies he suggested are or comment on those specific cases, but I'm always happy to meet with my honourable friend or receive correspondence from him if he has concerns in that regard.
Alison Thomas.
Speaker, it seems to me to ring a little bit hollow to say that companies are still trying to unwind their various operations in Russia, because if some companies can quite easily do that, can you explain to me why companies like Infosys are still working in Russia?
As I said to the Honourable Lady, and I apologise if this becomes a relatively repetitive point, I am not going to comment on specific individual companies, and as I say, there is very good reason for that, and it is long-standing Treasury policy, which I think any government would follow. We set out our policy. I read in my opening answer to the Right Honourable Lady the statement from the Prime Minister when he was Chancellor. We've been very clear we want to see companies divesting. There are some complexities in that, of course there are, but the position of the direction of travel is very clear.
Mark Francis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As a member of the House of Commons Defence Committee, about 3 weeks ago, we visited the Ukraine, and we were welcomed literally with open arms. So grateful are the Ukrainians for staunch British support. They know a hard winter is coming. So can I make a practical suggestion? They clearly need more weapons, but they also desperately need generators in order to keep hospitals and other critical facilities operating, even if they lose main power stations to missile strikes. Is there anything the Minister and the Government can do to encourage UK companies of all types that might be able to spare even 1 or 2 generators from their stocks to get those to Ukraine, where they'd be put to incredibly good use?
Well, my honourable friend speaks not only with his expertise on the Defence Select Committee, he served in His Majesty's Armed Forces and, of course, as a Defence Minister. And he makes a very important point. I was delighted to hear about his visit You know, it's inspirational to me, and I think to the rest of the country, when we see leading British politicians going over to Ukraine, showing that we're not afraid to go over there, and we'll give them every form of support that we can. In terms of the specifics on that support, it's a good point about generators. I don't know the specific answer on that, but I do know that very recently the Foreign Secretary set out measures to provide ambulances, for example. But of course, one of the points about the energy network is it's being affected by attacks from Russia. So military support remains so important because that's how we defend Ukraine, enable them, to defend themselves so that they can thwart these attacks. It is going to be tough. There will be further attacks. This is not going to finish tomorrow, Mr. Speaker, but I do think we're doing all we can, and it helps when people like my right honourable friend are going out there and showing the support of the British people.
Chris Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sorry, this is just terribly, terribly complacent. It's 3,218 days since the annexation of Crimea, and there are still British companies which seem to be invested in Crimea, let alone British companies that are still invested, including Infosys, from what I understand, the Minister not refuting the point earlier, Infosys still operating in Moscow and in Russia with a staffed office. He says he's not going to comment on individual companies. He does it all the time. That's what sanctions are. That's the whole point of sanctions. And £778 million worth of Russian oil has ended up coming into 10 British ports this year, having been transferred from one ship to another on the route here. This is complacency. We have to have a total effort from every department of government to make sure that we stop funding Putin's illegal war.
Yeah. Well, the Right Honourable Gentleman puts his points, as ever, with his usual passion. The point I was making was not to refute or in any way entertain points about individual companies. I'm simply saying it's long-standing Treasury policy not to comment on individual taxpayers, companies, or their commercial activities. And I would suspect that will be true of any government, Mr. Speaker. I would just say he mentions oil and what's happening. And just remind you, on Monday, in alignment with coalition partners, we banned the import of Russian oil and oil products into our markets, and in conjunction with partners, we have prohibited UK ships and services from the maritime transportation of Russian oil unless the price paid is at or below $60.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Secretary of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Ukraine and as a constituency MP with a large Ukrainian community, can I just once again please gently prompt my right honourable friend to urge BP, if they're unable to sell their stake in Rosneft, to please take the profits and commit them to the reconstruction of Ukraine and aid the victims of Putin's barbaric invasion.
Minister. Well, my honourable friend is right to remind us of the many Ukrainians who've made their home here, and of course the many UK nationals who have opened their home to them. It's been an extraordinary contribution. What I would say, though, is the reason that we don't comment on individual companies' commercial affairs is because, obviously, for a start, these are matters of commercial sensitivity. And I appreciate there are strong feelings on this point, but that is a consistent point, irrespective of the issue at hand. I think what we can say is that we've been very clear on the need to divest from Russia. We've put in place a very strong sanctions regime and banned further investment in Russia. I think that sends very strong signals, but we shouldn't detract from the fact that this country is second only to the United States in what it is doing to support the people of Ukraine.
Baron Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week I met with Andrei Zhupanyin, a counterpart of mine from the Energy Committee in the Ukrainian Parliament, and his priority was to source as many generators as possible to back up the Ukrainian energy system. So can I ask the Minister a specific question? Will he, at the very least, write to the CEO of BP to suggest that these monies be used to pay for generators for Ukraine?
Minister. Well, I think it's fair. I should comment that it's across the House that we've seen this sort of very positive attitude supporting Ukraine. I said on the specific of generators, I'm going to go away and look at that and write to the honourable gentleman and my honourable friend, because I don't have that specific answer to hand. In terms of what individuals, companies do, it's not something I'm going to comment on. What we're responsible for as Treasury is UK tax and spending decisions. I think we've been extremely clear in setting out a windfall tax, which will be funding energy support for our constituents this winter and now, in fact, next year. That is very generous support, and it is ultimately connected with the impact on our country from Putin's illegal invasion. All of this is about supporting the people of Ukraine, but also helping our people with the wider shocks resulting from that invasion.
Manchester.
Mr. Speaker, I very much welcome what the Minister said with regards to the United Kingdom stepping at the forefront
of supporting the people of Ukraine militarily, economically, diplomatically. As the former Minister for Sanctions, I agree with him. The United Kingdom took decisive firm action. But can I ask him to clarify a specific point? With regards to the oil price cap coming at $60 per barrel, that is not set in stone. And that can be subject to review, taking into account implementation, international adherence and alignment, market developments, potential impact on coalition members. When does he expect that review to take place, and so that we can take further decisive action looking at the levers that really having an impact?
Well, I'm grateful to my own friend who speaks with great expertise on these matters. I think the key point is that the action in relation to oil, Mr. Speaker, was agreed at a G7 level with Australia. And obviously, in terms of, you talk about review, it's very much about the constant efforts we have, the constant dialogue we have with international partners. That's where we'll be reviewing these things. Obviously, it's a step we have only just taken, but I'm happy to confirm, as ever, the Treasury keeps all these matters under review.
Sarah Orr.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. On the 17th of November, my honourable friend, the member for St Albans, asked the Prime Minister if he agreed with her that private citizens in the UK should follow the example of several British businesses and sell any shares that they have in businesses that still operate in Russia. Now, for some reason, the Prime Minister was unable to give my honourable friend an answer on that occasion, so I wonder if the Minister might be able to answer that question today.
Minister.
Well, as I said earlier, and it's a very important point, I understand why she asks it. The Prime Minister, as Chancellor in March, set out our very strong position on urging companies to divest, being clear that there was no further case to invest in Russia. In terms of what happens with individual shareholdings, I said I'm not going to comment on specific companies, and to be fair, she isn't asking me to. What I would say, and I hope we can all acknowledge, it is not necessarily straightforward to divest. We want companies to be doing that. But for example, and as I said earlier, I think in my supplementary answer to the Right Honourable Lady, if firms divest their shares, they have to be clear in doing so that any new owners are themselves going to be compliant with the sanctions regime, and then they're being sold onward into towards an entity or individual who is themselves part of the regime. So it isn't straightforward. That doesn't mean, and let me be clear, that we don't want to see every possible step being taken to divest.
John Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The flip side of this narrative, of course, that our companies do the right thing. I've been very concerned, though, Mr. Speaker. I've had reports locally of companies who have divested their interest in Russia, but are struggling now to get legal and audit services because they've had that previous interest, Mr. Speaker. Companies are reluctant to touch them. It's a bizarre situation that companies and organisations who have done the right thing can't access those statutory services. Can my honourable friend ensure that he has conversations across government, particularly perhaps with BEIS and also with professional service providers, to ensure that companies that do the right thing in respect of Russia aren't penalised as a result?
Well, my honourable friend, who I think was a lawyer by training, will be. It's a good example in that sector where one can imagine this might be happening. What I would say is, if firms are complying with the regime, then other firms should have no fear of working with them. If there are specific cases he wants to raise with me, as ever, he's welcome to write to me. But it is a very good point, and he's got it on the record.
Marie Rimmer.
Mr. Speaker, the French and Norwegian energy companies have successfully managed to exit Russia, while BP has not. This is embarrassing and a stain on Britain's reputation that needs correcting. We appear to be undermining our efforts to support Ukraine and its people. The Treasury must ensure that the use of the £508 million dividends due is used to provide aid to Ukraine and its people. Will the Minister ensure that if this doesn't happen, that we will legislate to ensure that this does happen?
Minister.
As I said, I understand why people make the leap between what they've heard alleged about the shareholding of a particular company and how that should be spent in an ideal world, as it were. I can't comment on an individual company or their commercial interests. I'm not going to, but I do understand why people make this point. It therefore falls to us to talk about where we can act. And she talks about humanitarian assistance. We've given over £6 billion of assistance, military aid, humanitarian assistance, and of course, second only to the United States in its scale, and it is having a huge impact. I think we can safely say the world did not expect Ukraine to fight back like it has done, Mr. Speaker, and and least of all, Vladimir Putin expected that. And one of the reasons for that is the armaments and training provided by the United Kingdom.
Simon Fell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. European payments for Russian oil and gas have totalled over €100 billion since
the illegal invasion of Ukraine began. Now, I welcome the efforts of this government and other governments to end the use of that oil and gas, but the fact remains that still millions of barrels of oil a day are being resold by third-party countries back into our markets. I wonder whether my honourable friend the Minister might be able to give some detail about what efforts are being put in place to stop this illegal resale, which is just giving succour to Putin and his illegal war.
Well, my honourable friend makes an excellent point. As I said earlier, it's not just that we've banned the import of Russian oil and oil products into our markets. In conjunction with parties, we prohibited UK ships and services from the maritime transportation of Russian oil unless the price paid is at or below $60. In other words, the onward trade from within our respective jurisdictions. But actually, my honourable friend effectively makes an important wider point, which is that the amount of money that has been spent in Europe on Russian energy historically, the fact is there has to be a long-term answer to this. Ultimately, we as a country and with our European partners and indeed G7 partners have got to wean ourselves off all forms of Russian energy. And the way we do that, as he knows, and he represents a Cumbrian constituency, is by, for example, investing in nuclear, it's by investing in UK energy production, and of course, Mr. Speaker, it's by living up to our net zero commitments and driving even further our offshore wind capacity, which I'm proud as an East Anglian MP to say is the largest array of offshore capacity in Europe.
Should the position of the government be that UK companies must not profit from activities that sustain Putin's war? And having said that, shouldn't the government say to those companies that where you do profit, we will use all the powers at our disposal to sequester those funds and make them available for the regeneration of Ukraine?
Well, of course, we have set out precisely that, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the commitments made by the Prime Minister when he was Chancellor in March, the desire to see businesses divesting from Russia. He's aware there have been many high-profile public cases of firms divesting, but other colleagues have spoken of companies in their constituencies that are all using the phrase which I think the right honourable lady, no, sorry, I apologise, the shadow Labour spokesman first used, which is doing the right thing, and I totally agree with that, and ultimately that's why we have the very strong sanctions regime that we do.
Very true.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I first of all congratulate my right honourable friend, the member for Barking, on securing this very important, urgent question, and associate myself with the calls for generators for Ukraine. Can I say to the Minister that for Putin to be defeated and for him to know he's going to be defeated, it's absolutely essential that there remains rock-solid support for Ukraine from the UK and the West. That's not just in terms of defence material and military equipment and humanitarian aid. It's also that no British company, for whatever reason, for whatever way, is benefiting the Russian regime and Putin's regime. Therefore, can I ask the Minister to go away? I know you mentioned about a desire to achieve certain things. A desire is not enough. Can he go away, look again about what more can be done within legislation, that is necessary new legislation, to ensure this situation stops, and make a statement back at this House next week?
Minister? Well, of course, we always keep our sanctions regime under review, and in particular with our international partners. We're looking at what more can be done in terms of illicit finance and so on. But these are, he talks about desires, these are very strong sanction measures in practice that are having an impact in Russia in practice on Russia's economy, sanctioning 1,200 individuals, 120 entities. We've already had reported frozen assets of £18.4 billion. And of course, as I said, and what matters above all, he wants us to stand with the people of Ukraine. He wants us to show that we support them. I don't think any country other than the United States has done more than we have. We should be proud of what we've done, but absolutely, I give him this guarantee, we will work night and day as a government to keep supporting the people of Ukraine.
A UK company, namely the LTA, being fined $1 million by the LTA, being fined $1 million by top of a similar fine and ruling from the WTA. Would the Minister join me in condemning both the ATP? Would the Minister join me in condemning both the ATP and the WTA, who have both shown an extraordinary lack of empathy towards the people of Ukraine, given they were rightly urged by ministers to ban Russian players from the tournaments? Might the government pay these fines for the LTA should any appeals fail?
Minister.
Well, it's a very interesting point. As he says, my colleagues have been very clear on the record where we stand on this. I'm not going to comment on any specific appeals, etc. I just think the point is our sanction regime, which he's referred to, is very strong. It is working in practice. Of course, we are always committed to looking at what more can be done, both as a government and working with our international partners.
Coulter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Fenner Dunlop have existed in Marfleet, in my constituency of East Hull, since the company Fenner was established in 1861. They manufacture conveyor belts for the mining industry. They've refused to trade in Russia. They've done the right thing. As a result, they're reviewing the business in Marfleet, and there's potentially 71 jobs at risk. I think everybody can see that they need to be commended. They're an excellent employer. But the reason the Minister is having difficulty mentioning specific businesses is because one of them is in forces. Does he want to put his finger on why he's got to struggle to talk about that business?
Minister?
Well, I'm very grateful, as ever, for the honourable gentleman's question. All I would say, in terms of his point about the company he refers to in his constituency, I think it's a company in Marfleet. All I would say is, there will be economic impact at home from companies divesting their interests in Russia, without doubt. They would have gone into that market for a commercial reason, and obviously there will be a commercial impact if they divest. What I would say is we have to do everything possible to show our resolve to the people of Ukraine, and that includes strong economic sanctions, even if they have an impact. But by far the biggest economic impact, Mr. Speaker, is on our economy from the enormous surge in energy prices and the inflation that resulted. It is inflation, global inflation, which will be driving the economy around the world experiencing a hiatus in growth. We want to see growth returning, and that is precisely why, Mr. Speaker, one of the reasons we have windfall taxes is to raise the funding to support our constituents through this winter and to support businesses.
And this Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Minister can't fail to have noticed the exhibition in Parliament in Portcullis House, which shows the gross human rights abuses by Russian forces in Ukraine. As well as justice, the victims of these war crimes deserve compensation. So far, this hasn't come from seizing and distributing the assets of Putin's allies or the Russian state. Why can't it come from BP and others' Russian earnings?
Minister.
Well, I always enjoyed working with the honourable gentleman in my previous position at Ministry of Justice, and he makes an extremely powerful point. I mean, the abuses that we've seen have been horrific. He's right to draw attention to them. What I would say is there are a great range of activities being taken place in that regard. For example, the significant support we've given to the International Criminal Court in Hague so that they can look into them. But of course, this will be very difficult until we get resolution to conflict, which is why the most important thing we can do for all those cases is to continue supporting the people of Ukraine, supporting their armed forces and the humanitarian effort.
Jonathan Edwards.
Mr. Speaker, I fully support the Right Honourable Member for Barking in her efforts. Wouldn't one way to dissuade UK companies from investing in Russian oil assets and to encourage disinvestment be to prohibit them or any such companies from benefiting from the North Sea windfall tax investment allowance?
The Honourable makes an interesting point, knitting together those 2 points. And to be fair to him, I have to say he's consistently attended, I think, all of the recent Treasury debates that I've attended in, so I'm grateful to him for that. What I would say is we shouldn't confuse divesting and investing. And we're clear there is an outright ban on investing in Russia. The Prime Minister said back in March when he was Chancellor there was no case for such investment. And of course, divestment is happening. It is a process. For some companies, it will take time. But I think we're all clear that we want to see that happening. In terms of the windfall tax, he's absolutely right to highlight, whilst it will raise the more than £40 billion to support our economy, to help us fund public services, and above all, support with energy bills this winter, it does have a generous allowance. But let me be clear why, and it goes back to my answer to my honourable friend, which is that whilst we want to raise funds from the levy. We also want to incentivise investment in energy security, because ultimately that is the long-term answer to this question of how we defend ourselves against being held to ransom over energy prices. It's by ensuring we have energy security for the future.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister very much for his answer to the UQs, and it's very clear to this House and to myself that the Honourable Gentleman is doing his best to try and address in a firm way this issue. We have seen not only the continued involvement of UK companies in Russia, but also the ongoing involvement of Russian companies and kleptocrats infiltrating UK companies to commit potential fraud. What steps can the Minister take to ensure that UK companies are discouraged from partaking in any involvement with the Russian economy, and that a harder stance is taken to protect our own economy from economic crime promoted and infiltrated by Russia itself?
Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, as ever, you saved the best to last, and very grateful to the honourable gentleman for his very kind words. What I would say to him is, he talks about protecting the economy. Yes, there's the legal side to that, the sanctions regime, protecting our economy from, the impact of sanctioned individuals, sanctioned companies. But I think the most important way to protect our economy is by providing support to businesses and our constituents this winter. That includes constituents in Northern Ireland, with the many energy schemes that we'll be bringing forward that have those specific applications in Northern Ireland. I know he's taken a keen interest, and we're working with BEIS to ensure that we deliver those programmes in Northern Ireland as well as in the rest of the United Kingdom. But he makes an excellent point. Ultimately, we're not just supporting the people of Ukraine, we're supporting our businesses and our constituents.
That can't come now. It's got to come after the next statement. Well, we can't change the rules because there's more than yourself. That's my problem. I open a whole can of worms, which I'd love to, but I dare not. Right. Before the statement, I wish to make a short statement about the sub judice resolution. I've been advised that there are relevant, active legal proceedings in the Court of Appeal. I am exercising the discretion given to the Chair in respect of matters of sub judice to allow reference to those proceedings as they concern issues of national importance. However, I urge members to exercise caution in what they say and to avoid referring in detail to cases that remain before the courts. I now call the Secretary of State, Grant Shapps.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I should like to make a statement about Horizon Post Office Group litigation compensation. Mr. Speaker, the Horizon scandal is nothing short of a travesty. Today, I turn to those who've lost everything, those who've been driven to bankruptcy, lost the savings they worked all their lives for, those who were falsely accused and lost their good name in our country's courts, and those who were falsely convicted lost their freedom in our country's prisons. And all of those, having lost all of that, is possible, then took their own lives. To say we should have not been here, and this should not have happened, should have been said years ago. And I want to say today, Mr. Speaker, that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for those years of pain, of hurt, of anguish.